There are villages in England that seem untouched by time. Nestled between the damp hills of Dorset and the rolling fog of the moors, they keep their secrets well. Their lanes quiet, their churches locked, their gravestones unreadable. And yet, among them all, Dunmere Hollow remains the most unsettling of all. Today, it's little more than a collection of moss-covered stones and a crumbling chapel swallowed by ivy. But in the 1870s, it was a thriving butcher's town, known for its prize cattle and for the man who supplied nearly every table for miles. Edward Talbot, the village butcher. By all accounts, Talbot was a decent man, steady, well-liked, and dedicated to his craft. His shop stood at the corner of the main square, marked by a wooden sign that swung faintly in the wind. Those who knew him said he took pride in his cleanliness. The floors of his shop scrubbed spotless, the knives polished to a silver sheen. He lived just behind the store with his wife Margaret and their only daughter Eliza, a quiet, pale child, often seen helping her father wrap parcels of meat in brown paper. For years, the Talbots seemed like any other family in the Hollow, until Margaret fell ill. It began with a fever in the spring of 1873, something that took her to bed and never let her rise again. Edward closed the shop for 2 weeks to care for her, but when she died, something in him seemed to wither alongside her. After the funeral, neighbors said they rarely saw him smile. He stopped attending church. He stopped speaking to anyone outside the shop. Even his once cheerful daughter Eliza began to change. She was 16 when the whispers started. At first, it was only gossip. Villagers noticing that Edward and Eliza never spoke to others, that she no longer attended school or services. But as time went on, they began to appear different. She no longer called him father in public, and he, in turn, never called her child. They were seen walking arm in arm through the market one evening, something that, on its own, might have been innocent, had it not been for the way he looked at her. Not like a father, more like a man protecting something he could not lose again. By autumn, the Hollow was whispering openly. The vicar paid a visit to the Talbot home, and though no one knew what was said, his face afterward was pale as milk. He left the village 2 weeks later and never returned. That winter, Edward stopped delivering to the manor houses and kept his shop closed most days. When he did open, his hands were red and trembling. The meat, some said, had an odd taste, salted heavier than usual, darker in color. Few dared to ask questions. Then came the night of the snowstorm, the one the parish records still mention, though never by name. At dawn, the constable found footprints in the drifts outside the butcher's shop, 2 sets side by side, leading into the woods behind the house. The tracks were close together, almost as if the pair were walking in step, but only one set came back. 3 days later, Edward Talbot appeared in the village square, calm, freshly shaved, his clothes pressed as though nothing had happened. He reopened the shop that very morning. When customers asked after Eliza, he smiled faintly and said, "She's resting." When pressed further, he added, "She's finally mine." It wasn't until spring, when the thaw came, that the children found something buried near the stream, a small silver ring bent out of shape. Inside, faintly engraved, were the words, "To my dearest Eliza," from E.T. The initials matched the man who claimed to have lost everything. Even now, standing in the ruins of Dunmere Hollow, locals say the air feels heavy near where the butcher's shop once stood. The smell of salt and iron lingers there, faint, like old blood that refuses to fade. And some claim that if you listen closely at dusk, you can still hear the faint creak of a hanging sign swaying in the wind, marking the place where love and madness became one. After Eliza's disappearance, life in Dunmere Hollow did not return to normal. It simply continued, as if the village itself had agreed to forget. The butcher's shop reopened, the church bell rang as usual, and yet, beneath that fragile calm, something had changed. Edward Talbot went about his work in silence. He no longer spoke to customers unless absolutely necessary. Some said he had aged 10 years in a month, though others whispered he looked lighter somehow, as if the burden of grief had lifted. He no longer wore black for his wife. Instead, he wore grey, the colour of the sky before rain. At night, a faint glow could be seen through the cracks in the floorboards of the shop. A candle burning below, in the cellar where he stored his cuts of meat. It was where Eliza had always helped him, trimming and cleaning, careful and quiet. And now it was where he spent nearly every evening, alone. One night, a neighbour delivering milk claimed to hear voices through the butcher's back door. A man's low murmur and a woman's softer reply, rhythmic, gentle as though in conversation. The sound of movement followed, a chair being pulled, the faint clinking of metal. When the neighbour called out, the voices stopped instantly. The next morning, Edward greeted him at the shop, smiling faintly, his eyes red and sleepless. "Long nights," he said. "I find comfort in work." But what kind of work required candlelight and whispers in the dark? It wasn't until the spring thaw that the truth began to take shape. A delivery boy, tasked with fetching salt from the cellar, returned pale and shaking. He swore he'd seen something impossible, a woman's dress, ivory white, lace-trimmed, hanging neatly beside the butcher's aprons. Beneath it, a bouquet of pressed flowers wrapped in paper with a note pinned to it. It read only, "For my bride." The constable dismissed it as rumour, but the boy refused to enter the shop again. In May of that same year, an unfamiliar man arrived in the Hollow, a preacher from Exeter, travelling under the name Reverend Baines. He claimed he'd been invited to perform a private ceremony for a widower. No one thought much of it until he asked for directions to Talbot's butchery. He was never seen again. For decades afterward, the villagers spoke of the smell that came from the cellar that summer. Not the scent of meat, but something sweet, almost floral. Some said it was embalming fluid. Others said Edward had taken to preserving his wares in strange ways, mixing salt with honey to keep them fresh. Whatever the truth, his descent was slow and deliberate. He began talking to himself openly, muttering about love that could not die, about vows that needed keeping. A surviving ledger from his shop, now kept in the Dorset archives, records the date June 9th, 1874, with a single entry written in precise, careful handwriting. Union complete. Underneath, another line. She will never leave again. That summer, Edward closed the shop entirely. He boarded up the windows and refused entry to anyone. The only sound from within was the rhythmic thump of a cleaver. Steady, measured, almost ritualistic. When the constable finally forced the door open weeks later, the shop was spotless. Not a speck of blood, not a sign of struggle. Only the cellar door remained locked, sealed with heavy nails from the inside. They found his chair positioned before it, as though he had been sitting there, listening. On the wall behind, carved into the plaster, was a single phrase, "Till death unites us again." The cellar wasn't opened until nearly 50 years later, during the restoration of the old building. Inside, they discovered remnants of a wedding supper, porcelain plates, tarnished cutlery, and a moulded cake turned to dust. At the center of the table, two chairs sat facing each other. One bore a man's name carved into the wood, E.T. The other was blank, but beside it lay a fragment of lace and a dried bouquet of pressed flowers. Even after all these years, the cellar smelled faintly of salt and roses. Those who visit the ruins of Dunmere Hollow today say the cellar door still stands, half buried in earth and ivy. And on nights when the wind passes through the hollow streets, it carries a faint metallic echo, a blade striking wood in slow, perfect rhythm. Not work, not madness, just devotion, echoing through time. By the time the 20th century crept upon Dunmere Hollow, the story of Edward Talbot had turned into a kind of local legend, one the villagers did not quite believe, but never dared to retell aloud. The butcher's shop had long been abandoned, its roof sagging, its windows boarded, yet no one would buy the land, not even when the council offered it for nearly nothing. But silence does not erase history. It merely buries it. In 1921, when a team of surveyors arrived from Dorchester to assess the foundations for a new road, they uncovered what had lain hidden for nearly half a century. Beneath the warped floorboards of the old butcher's parlour, they found a cavity, dry, shallow, and disturbingly deliberate. Inside were remnants that no one could mistake for anything else. Fragments of fabric, ivory buttons, and the delicate bones of a hand still wearing a wedding ring. The ring, engraved faintly, read, "Eliza Talbot." The news spread quickly. Papers from across Dorset descended upon the tiny hollow, their headlines screaming scandal. Butcher's bride unearthed after 47 years. But those who lived nearby said the discovery changed the air. The nights grew quieter, the mist heavier, as though the village itself had remembered what it was meant to forget. The investigation that followed was brief and inconclusive. The coroner's report described the remains as female, approximately 20 years of age, preserved unnaturally well due to salting compounds in surrounding soil. It concluded that she had been interred with ceremonial care. No one ever found Edward Talbot's body. His will, discovered years later in the archives of Exeter, left everything to his beloved wife and eternal companion, Eliza. Dated 1 month before his disappearance, it was signed in a trembling hand, the ink smudged as though by tears. One line stood out, written in smaller script at the bottom of the page. "When they find her, they will find me too, though not where they expect." That cryptic promise haunted investigators for decades. Some believed he had taken his own life nearby, perhaps in the woods beyond the village. Others claimed his remains had been hidden with hers. But those who dared to visit the ruins said otherwise. Visitors described the cellar as untouched, everything frozen in time, the plates still arranged on the table, the air unnaturally still. The locals said it was cursed ground. No birds ever perched on the chimney, no fox ever crossed the yard. And when it rained, water never pooled over the butcher's doorstep. It simply ran around it as though repelled. By the 1950s, the hollow had been swallowed by bramble and fog. Only a handful of residents remained, mostly old farmers and their widowed daughters, who refused to speak of the place after dark. They said you could still hear the faint sound of a cleaver striking wood, steady as a heartbeat. And sometimes, if you passed by the ruin at dawn, a pale figure could be seen in the window, standing perfectly still, as if waiting to be called. It was not until 1972 that a historian from Bristol, Dr. Leonard Parry, attempted to document the entire affair. His research was exhaustive, piecing together parish records, personal letters, and one remarkable photograph, a faded sepia portrait showing a man in a butcher S apron and a young woman in a lace gown. Both faced the camera, their expressions neutral, eyes dark. The back of the photo bore a date, June 9th, 1874. Dr. Parry published a short paper titled The Dunmere Union, a study in obsession and isolation. In it, he proposed a chilling theory, that Edward Talbot had not simply buried his daughter beneath his shop, but had attempted to preserve her and himself in ritual union. The details were too grotesque to print in full, but one note in the margin read, "A body salted. Surroundings suggest embalming intention, not madness, method." After Parry's article, Dunmere Hollow was sealed off entirely. The council declared the area unsafe due to soil instability, though locals knew better. The land, they said, was trying to bury what had been disturbed, to fold itself over the wound left by that cellar and its long-forgotten wedding feast. Today, all that remains is a stone marker placed by the County Historical Society. It bears no names, no dates, only a single line etched in Latin, "Amor in morte vincit." Love conquers in death. But those who pass by at night say that if you listen closely, beneath the wind and the rustle of trees, you can still hear the faintest whisper echoing from the ground below. A man's voice. Calm, steady, devoted, repeating the same words over and over again, union complete. By the late 20th century, Dunmere Hollow had all but vanished from official maps. Roads that once led there were rerouted, and what remained of the village was little more than a collection of broken chimneys, a dried well, and the faint outline of the butcher's foundations beneath a blanket of wild thorns. Locals in nearby towns, however, never stopped talking about it. Farmers warned travelers to avoid the old path after dark. Hunters refused to cross the valley, claiming their dogs would whimper and turn back before reaching the ruins. And children were told, as they had been for generations, never to follow the sound of ringing metal carried on the wind. For a long time, that's all Dunmere Hollow was, a story told to keep people away. But in 1983, that story took a darker turn. A group of amateur historians, inspired by Dr. Leonard Parry's lost research, ventured into the hollow with recording equipment and lanterns. Their goal was to document what remained of the butcher's shop and recover any physical trace of its cellar. They never officially published their findings because 2 of them never came back. The surviving members returned to town before dawn, shaken and incoherent. Their clothes were soaked in mud, their hands trembling. One, a young woman named Alice Greaves, refused to speak for several days. When she finally did, her words were simple. "We heard it. The cleaver. It wasn't an echo." According to their notes, the team reached the ruins shortly after midnight. The cellar door was still visible, half buried, its hinges rusted but intact. They claimed to have felt vibrations through the earth, rhythmic, deliberate, as though something heavy struck the ground below in perfect intervals. When they forced the hatch open, they found a staircase descending into darkness. The air was still, heavy with the scent of salt and rot. They shone their torches down but saw nothing. And then, just before they turned to leave, one of them swore they heard a voice. Not a shout, not a whisper, just a man's voice, clear as day, murmuring, "She's waiting." Authorities dismissed the event as hysteria, a result of exhaustion, fear, and folklore. Yet a local newspaper, the Dorset Chronicle, printed a small article 2 weeks later under the headline, "Amateurs Unearth New Scandal in Forgotten Hamlet." It was accompanied by a photograph, grainy, barely visible, showing the ruins of the butcher's shop. In the background, behind the low stone wall, stood what appeared to be a figure. Some said it was a trick of light, others that it was a shadow cast by one of the team. But those who zoomed in on the image noticed something uncanny. The figure's posture, straight-backed, motionless, and holding something long and slender at its side, like a blade. The Chronicle retracted the article a week later, claiming photographic error. After that, Dunmere Hollow was declared off-limits. The county fenced off the land, citing safety concerns due to soil collapse and contamination. But strange reports continued. Hikers hearing rhythmic tapping at night, campers finding footprints in the mud that led nowhere, and one driver who swore a pale woman stepped in front of his car on the old coastal road, only to vanish when he braked. He described her in his report, young white dress, holding flowers. When asked if he might have imagined it, he simply said, "I could smell the salt on her dress." In the decades that followed, Dunmere Hollow became something else entirely. Not a village, not a ruin, but a void. The land refused to be built upon. Every attempt to pave it, drain it, or plant over it ended in failure. Foundations cracked, trees refused to root. One engineer described it perfectly in a local interview. "It's as though the ground is breathing, rejecting us." And perhaps, in some way, it was. For if you stand on the ridge above the hollow at twilight, you'll notice something strange. The fog doesn't drift like it does elsewhere. It gathers, it coils inward, as though drawn toward a single point beneath the earth, the place where the cellar once stood. And if you listen, really listen, you'll hear the wind hum a familiar rhythm. Not quite words, not quite song, just the steady, patient sound of something or someone still working below. The cleaver, the vow, the unending rhythm of devotion. In 2006, long after Dunmere Hollow had been declared lost to time, the land was quietly purchased by a private developer. The plan was to clear the area, dig foundations, and turn the site into a rural retreat, a small collection of cottages overlooking the moor. For the first time in more than a century, heavy machinery rolled into the valley, clearing brush and leveling the soil. For the first few days, the work went smoothly, but on the fifth morning, the crew found something unusual, a layer of compacted earth so dense that their equipment couldn't break through. Beneath it, metal, a rectangular structure buried deeper than any of their plans showed. The foreman assumed it was the roof of an old cold cellar. They began to dig. When the first slab gave way, a hollow breath escaped from the earth below, as though the ground itself exhaled after holding something in for far too long. The air was cold, stale and heavy with the faint scent of salt. Inside the cavity, they found wooden beams arranged in a perfect square. Beneath them, a trap door, and carved into that door, almost perfectly preserved, were the initials E.T. Local authorities halted construction immediately. Archaeologists were called in, the site was fenced off. But before the hatch could be officially opened, one of the workers, a man named Thomas Avery, vanished. His co-workers claimed he'd gone back to the site at night, muttering about hearing voices beneath the soil. They found his car parked at the edge of the hollow, engine still running, headlights pointing toward the excavation. His footprints led halfway to the cellar entrance, and then simply stopped. The next morning, when police returned to secure the area, they discovered that the trap door had been lifted. The cellar was empty. No tools, no remains, nothing but damp earth and a faint metallic smell. The archaeologists sealed it again, and this time they poured concrete over the entrance. The project was abandoned. Months later, one of the site supervisors, a woman named Margaret Holt, received an unmarked envelope at her office in Exeter. Inside was a single item, an old photograph printed on glass, a Victorian portrait showing a man in a Butcher A.S. apron and a young woman in white. The image matched the one from Dr. Parry's 1972 study, except for one detail. This version was sharper, clearer, and it showed a third figure standing just behind them, a man, tall and blurred at the edges, with a face that looked eerily similar to Thomas Avery, the missing worker. No one could explain it. The photograph was analyzed, scanned, even tested for authenticity. The plate was genuine, dated to the 19th century. So how did a man who vanished in 2006 appear in a photograph taken in 1874? The story never reached the papers. The site was quietly bought again, this time by a historical preservation group. They fenced it off and declared it unsafe for excavation. The official record calls it an unstable sinkhole. But the locals of Dorset know better. They say that on foggy mornings, if you stand at the edge of the hollow, you can still see faint movement near the earth. A figure kneeling, working slowly with its hands, as though shaping the ground into something familiar. And if you dare to call out, it will stop, it will stand, and it will turn toward you, not angrily, not violently, just with the slow, steady calm of a man who has been waiting far too long for someone to remember his story. Even now, archivists who handle the Dunmere files report strange things, missing pages, typewritten lines that shift when reread, photographs that fade only in certain parts, always around the man in the apron. One historian wrote in her final notes before retiring, "Every time I open the file, the smell returns, salt, iron and roses." Perhaps the vow Edward Talbot made was never broken. Perhaps devotion that deep never truly dies. Perhaps some loves, the kind that defy law, reason, and God himself, echo longer than the rest. The ruins remain sealed beneath the soil, their story muffled by time. But if you walk far enough into the valley where Dunmere Hollow once stood, you'll hear it. Faint, measured, rhythmic. A sound older than the wind, older than forgiveness. The sound of a blade striking wood, over and over, in perfect, patient rhythm.